Hello, my name is Jonathan Ng, and I'm with my colleague Zach Kahn of the Center for Presidential History. Today we have the privilege to speak with Alison Dreizen about the life and the legacy of Walter LaFeber. And before I forget, I should also note that it is October 29th of 2023, and we are at the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island. So thank you, Alison, for agreeing to sit for this interview.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start out by just hearing about how you first encountered Walter LaFeber, either in his work or in teaching, or how you first came into contact with the historian.
Sure. Well, I was a student at Cornell. I actually started at Cornell as a freshman in the ILR school, which is the Industrial Labor Relations School. There were a lot of course requirements as a freshman, so I did not really get to take Walt's course, although it was quite famous, not just in the art school, but in all the schools. His introductory lecture on the history of American foreign relations was probably one of the most talked about classes at the university for undergrads. So I actually switched into the Arts and Sciences School my sophomore year and got to take that course. Found that not only was he a fabulous professor and the course was fascinating, but he was also extremely approachable, and actually agreed to become my advisor. So that was my sophomore year, and then after that I took several other courses with him, and he was my honors thesis advisor.
Wow. Could you talk about what drew you to LaFeber's classes and led you to choose him as your advisor?
Well, I personally was interested in, I'd done a fair amount of traveling even as a high school student in the summers. Spent one summer in France and Switzerland, another summer in Israel, and a third summer, the summer right before I started school, actually in Japan with something called the Experiment in International Living, which was, and it may still be around, but it's a program that takes high school students and places them in foreign countries. You learn the language for a few weeks, which in Japan meant you learn how to say hello, because that's pretty much all you could learn in a few weeks. And then you live with a Japanese family and travel for 2 weeks with the member of the family who's closest in age to you and the group of students that are there. So I had done that in Japan the summer before my freshman year of college. So I already was very interested in sort of I liked history, and then I was very interested in cross-border relations just from my personal experiences. And so it was like a natural fit when I found that course.
Awesome. I'm also wondering, do you recall what year this would have been and what the general social and political environment was? I asked because some of the interviewees that we've talked to have said that they went to LaFeber's course because they were trying to understand what was the politics of their moment, or what was happening on.
No, that's not why I did it. But I thought you meant the Cornell politics, because they, of course, were also fairly fraught in those years. So I graduated in 1974. The 2 spring semesters before I got to Cornell campus, classes and exams had been canceled, both of those semesters, for various student uprisings, and one of which, I'm sure this has been relayed to you, was very upsetting to Professor LaFeber, and he had a maybe not quite super popular view of what was going on and what the administration should do in reaction to it. All that was before my time, so I don't have any personal knowledge of that, but it was during the end of the Vietnam War, basically. So, but that was not why I was interested in the class, honestly.
And so you've talked very eloquently about your interest in international affairs. You traveled a lot, and this sort of bigger personal context to why you gravitated toward LaFeber's courses and chose him as an advisor. Could you also talk a little bit about what his actual classes were like? What do you remember of his interactions with him in class? And maybe some of the advice that he gave you as an advisor.
Well, the survey course, of course, there was no interaction because it was a huge class, 3 times a week, including Saturdays, and always full. Standing room, especially on Saturdays, actually, when there were parents in town or, kids who were looking at Cornell as an option, or, there was a football game, so there were kids from other schools, whatever. So his classes were packed, and there were no questions from the audience. He would very famously go up to the front of the room, write down a 4-line outline of what he was going to discuss, and then proceed to speak for 50 minutes without notes, in complete paragraphs, without stuttering or saying and making it sound like he was just making it up at the time, which was incredibly impressive to everybody, I think, in the audience, or in the class, I guess. Not really, but it was kind of an audience. So that class was not conducive to interactions. He also was, as all the Cornell professors at that time, and maybe still now, he would have office hours a few times a week and was happy to talk to anybody about anything who showed up. And that's where my initial interaction began, was through his office hours. Excuse me. He had a particular point of view, especially in those days, in terms of his view of American foreign relations, and he was very much an economic determinist. And just because I was kind of a contrarian, I kept trying to approach things in a different way. I remember the first paper I wrote, which was for a different course that he taught, was on the war against the Barbary states in the early 1800s, I guess. And did some original research through newspapers and other things at the time. And my thesis was essentially that it was caused by racism, not by economics. And this was in 1972, which is probably before most people were kind of looking at that as a possible rationale for U.S. actions. But he was very open to a different point of view, even if it was not the one that he maybe thought you might come up with given his courses. And then my focus, given the time I'd spent in Japan, and also I was now studying the Japanese language, and I went back to Japan a few times. So my focus going forward was more in Asia than in Europe, not Vietnam, but China and Japan. And at that point, that was also something that he hadn't spent a lot of time focusing on. So he was very open again to, exploring. I think my initial paper was on the move from China to Japan after World War II, in terms of who our most reliable ally was going to be in Asia. And again, he was very open to a different approach and different focus than the ones that he had been working on before. So.
Well, those are really neat projects. Do you recall what galvanized your interest in doing a research project on U.S. relations with the Barbary states?
No, I don't. Other than it seemed really interesting and unusual. It was, I believe, under Jefferson, and Jefferson was kind of an isolationist. So the idea that the U.S. was involved in a foreign war in his administration just seemed interesting to me. Like, why did that happen?
Another thing that caught my attention was how you talked about the economic focus of LaFeber. He was very much a product of the Wisconsin School of History, which put an emphasis on economic frameworks and
Right.
factors. I'm curious, did you ever see students give pushback against his views in the volume, Thinking Otherwise, that they're publishing? There's one mention of the conservative commentator Ann Coulter, who apparently took one of his classes.
That was way after me.
And
Way after me.
but what interested me is LaFeber was obviously an extremely skilled teacher, really mesmerizing and charismatic in his own very particular way. Was there ever pushback in the classroom, particularly because, I mean, teaching U.S. foreign relations in the early 1970s in the wake of the Vietnam War, with Watergate, this sort of political environment, was there ever a sense of opposition to what he was doing on campus, or
not to my recollection, no. First of all, I think it probably coincided with the views of a lot of people. You know, why were we interested in Vietnam? Why were we interested in other relations with other states? It was, you know, whether it was the oil countries or whatever. I think that may have a lot of people either came in with that point of view or left with that point of view, or both. So no, I don't remember any particular pushback to that point of view. I mean, as I said, I'm a contrarian at heart, so I did it, even if I had believed it, I wanted to not agree. So I took a slightly different approach in a lot of what I was doing.
It seems like, in a sense, your contrarian manner of thinking maybe resonated with LaFeber because he wanted to get students to think critically. The term that has been thrown around a lot at this conference is to think otherwise. LaFeber apparently liked to cite the historian Carl Becker, who said, to be a professor is to think otherwise. Are there ways that LaFeber taught you how to think otherwise or to think differently, or that maybe he encouraged you to continue to think critically and to see your world in that contrarian way?
Probably, but it was at a level of subtlety that I can't say, oh, well, he said this to me and that pointed me in that direction. So no. But I'm sure on some level that was the case. But no, I can't point to anything in particular and say, oh, because he said this, that, you know, made me do that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have other memories that you would like to share from your undergraduate days with Professor LaFeber?
Sure, yeah. So, again, what I always say to people about Cornell is very special, or was. I assume it still is. I don't know that for a fact. Because the professors, almost all the professors I had were preeminent in their field, but they really liked to teach. So that, you know, because nobody goes to Ithaca if they don't want to teach. You know, if you could be at Harvard or Georgetown or, you know, Columbia in a different kind of environment than Ithaca, New York, it takes a certain kind of person to say, no, I want to teach it at Cornell. And so the professors were all, that I had and I dealt with, were extremely approachable, loved teaching, and were great teachers. And that made it a very unique experience in many ways compared to, I then went on to law school, and not only compared to my law school experience, but compared to the experience that, you know, I discussed with kids who would come from other universities. I'm not saying it's unique, but it was certainly unusual. And he was one of the most obvious examples of that.
Were there lessons that you took from your time at Cornell with LaFeber to your graduate studies and your postgraduate career?
Yes. I'm actually going to be on the second panel this afternoon. And that's, I guess, one of the questions were sort of. So I can give you an anecdote that, I don't know, are you filming the panels as well or no?
Oh, no. So feel free to say whatever's on your mind.
So, as I said, when I was writing my honors thesis, it was going to be about the U.S. Policy towards Japan under Kissinger. So basically, Henry Kissinger did not seem to have a lot of affinity towards Asia. He was much more Eurocentric. That had been not only where he came from, but his intellectual interests had been, what happened in the 1880s in Austria, not anything beyond that. So he really didn't have much of an understanding of Asia, and in particular Japan. And there were a number of actions that were taken by the Nixon administration, which greatly upset Japan as an ally, and they were known as the Nixon shocks. And so I was writing my honors thesis about that, and basically why that happened, and why the two countries were actually speaking past each other and not understanding each other in terms of what was going on. So I was spending the summer, I'm sorry, this is probably a long story, but anyway, I was spending the summer before my senior year in Japan, and I had, as part of my anticipation of the thesis, I was planning to interview a number of Japanese people, both in media, academia, and the government, about their attitudes toward the U.S., and then I was going to do some of the same on the U.S. side. And I had all the interviews in Japan lined up, and Professor LaFeber, suggested I talk to Edwin Reischauer, who was at the time a former U.S. ambassador to Japan, and at the time he was a professor at Harvard. So I knew that my Japanese language teacher knew him and had worked with him. So I approached her and said, basically, can you give me an introduction? And her reaction was, no. Why would he want to talk to you? You're nobody. He's a very busy man, and he's talking to very important people, and he's not going to want to spend any time with you. So I went back to Walt, and I told him that, and he just said, I don't think that sounds right. I think he would be happy to talk to you. Why don't we see what happens? So this was 1973. I wrote him a letter, like an actual, letter on paper and with a stamp and everything. Sent that off to Boston, and by return mail, got a letter saying, I would love to speak to you. It's probably better if we do this in person. Can you come up to Cambridge and talk to me, and blah, blah, blah. So I did. I went up there and I spent 2 or 3 hours with him. And he was obviously extremely gracious. So, long story, but to me what that illustrated was, again, you could be preeminent in your field and, spoken to by, dealing with people on a level that I, as a college student, was not dealing. And that doesn't mean that, you can't take time to be basically nice to anybody. And Walt definitely personified that. So again, in his office hours, he would talk to anybody about anything for a long time. He was very perplexed when I came back and said that this other professor had said he wouldn't talk to me. Like, I can't even imagine why that would be the case. So that is something that I took with me. Not that I am preeminent in my field, but you always need to leave time for, people who want to speak with you.
Well, that's a great story and a great lesson, and I really think it does testify to the importance that LaFeber put on teaching and also mentorship and just being a nice human being.
And, it's not a direction that my mind always goes, but I was at Cornell between 70 and 74. And the idea that he would spend that much time and that much effort and that much focus mentoring a female student was unusual. There was never at any point in my interactions with him then or later, and I stay in touch with him basically for decades, was there any feeling that he was treating me any differently than he would have if I was of the male persuasion? So
that's great, and it's something that we've heard from other people who work with him who are women. My understanding is that in the mid-70s, he worked as a member of the advisory committee to the State Department for basically archival declassification. And the main State Department official he worked with was a woman who sort of helped sensitize him to the difficulties that women experience in the Foreign Service. And apparently that was a really positive interaction for both him and her. You mentioned that you stayed in contact with LaFeber after you graduated. What was that relationship like?
He actually, when I left, encouraged that. He wanted to know what I was doing, what I was up to, and he obviously knew I was going to law school. He'd written a recommendation for me and wanted me to stay in touch. I ended up working at a law firm that had a international presence, which in 1977 was not very common. So the firm I joined actually had, at that point, 3 non-U.S. offices. Now, that same firm, I'm not there anymore, but that same firm has probably 50 or 60 non-U.S. offices, but that was very unusual then. And again, I think I probably, in some part, chose that firm because of the international exposure it had, and as a result, I went to Hong Kong for a year with them, and then I headed up their Moscow office in the mid-90s. And at that point, I was very much, again, in touch with Walt and giving, my impressions, and he was asking questions. And then when I came back, we just stayed in touch. And as in when I was a student, he was always interested not just in your intellectual pursuits, but in you as a human being. And so I don't know whether it turned into a friendship because there was a huge age gap, but it felt like a friendship. I think on both sides. So.
Oh, that's lovely. I also imagine that his development as a scholar in subsequent years must have been interesting to you, and also your professional development interesting to him because he increasingly became interested in East Asia and in U.S. relations with Japan in particular, it seems.
Yes. Never gave me credit, but I think he should have. But yes, he did turn some of his focus onto Asia. And also, he became more of a talking head on TV, and especially during the Panama situation when Panama was being basically, when the canal was being given back to Panama, he was fairly, he was frequently, I think, interviewed on that because that had been one of his focuses. And he also, maybe because he was from Indiana, he was always a huge basketball fan. So his Michael Jordan book, I think, came out of, and to me that was also indicative of Walt's personality, that he wasn't just an intellectual. He was very much grounded and interested in a lot of things beyond his specialty, and was able then to make some connections between things he was otherwise interested in and things that he had been studying and take them in a different direction, which was interesting to me.
Do you also love sports?
Yes, but mostly baseball. Mm-hmm. So, and I think this is also indicative of Walt's personality. When he was a huge, as I'm sure you know, huge Chicago Cubs fan. And so he went through all the, I would say, ups and downs, but they were mostly downs with the Cubs. And then in the series when they were playing against the Indians, he was very excited that the Cubs were in the World Series. But he also said, which I just found so interesting from somebody who was a lifelong Cubs fan, that he wouldn't be upset if the Indians won because they hadn't won in a long time either, and they were a great team. Mm. So I'm like, whoa, that was a very surprising point of view. So even that far into our friendship, he was able to surprise me with some of his points of view.
Yeah, I would not expect that from your average fanatic Cubs fan.
Yes, exactly.
That's great. Are there other memories or experiences in your communication with him after your college experience that stick out to you?
I, at some point in like 2001, I adopted a child from China, which Walt knew I was doing. And he sent me a Cornell sweatshirt for her when she was, like 1. And basically was like, okay, this is hopefully the beginning of her Cornell career. And she actually did end up going to Cornell.
That's really sweet. Well, thinking about LaFeber's continued legacy, what do you think are some of the core life contributions, legacies that he left behind that continue to resonate?
Interesting question. I think his style and his approachability, I believe he passed down to generations of people who went into academia and became, history professors. I don't know that many of them, or maybe any of them personally, but I've heard stories. So I think that was one legacy. I think even into his 70s and 80s, he was extremely interested in a lot of different things. He had a lot of projects going on even after he retired. And I think that was another legacy, that don't rest on your laurels. There's a big world out there, a lot of things going on, and a lot of things that if you examine or delve into are not necessarily what they seem, and very interesting. So he had a lot of irons in the fire, and I think that was certainly inspiring to me, and I suspect it was inspiring to a lot of people that he dealt with. And, again, the third one was just what a extremely nice, approachable person he was, which is unusual. And hopefully I was not the only one who walked away from those encounters thinking, okay, that's something that I should incorporate into my dealings with others. In terms of intellectual, his theories or his approaches, I would leave that to academics. I'm not going to say what his academic or, intellectual legacy was, because after college, my interactions with him were very different from that. So I'll leave that to experts.
Well, I think that's a really beautiful reflection on the importance LaFeber attributed to relationships and how he sustained them for many years, even after his students left the classroom.
Yeah, I suspect that you're hearing that from not just me, that, he wanted to stay involved in people's lives and what they were doing. And actually, when I went to Moscow, he had a list of 3 or 4 of his former students who either were there or were going to be there or were working there. You should get in touch with so-and-so. And, so he was, as I said, excuse me, very interested in not just what you did as a student, but what you were doing as a person.
I also have a question about maybe his personal idiosyncrasies or how he managed his time. Because talking to you and other people who interacted with him as colleagues, as students, one thing that surprises me, it seems like he was doing everything at the same time. He was producing prolific scholarship, he was teaching, and he was also maintaining relationships with people all across the globe. I mean, his students really went everywhere. Do you have any sense of the secret to his
How
ability?
he did that?
Yeah,
I don't know, maybe he never slept. But yeah, there were always a lot of irons in the fire. And, as time went on, and after he stopped teaching, actually, I would ask him, what are you doing? What are you working on? And it was a very long list, which to me was, first of all, the idea that you could be doing research on 3 or 4 different things simultaneously that have very little in common was, especially, later in your career, was really surprising to me in a good way. That's not easy to do.
Yeah, it's super impressive, and I think also a testament to his voracious curiosity, because
Yes.
his books just cut across so many different topics. Well, this has been a lovely interview. Any other final words that you would like to put into the record?
I'm not the only one for whom Walt was a huge influence in my life. I mean, when I say to people, when I told people I was coming, to this conference, about my college advisor, 95, especially people who didn't know that I had a relationship with him, 95% you were in touch with your college advisor. I mean, that's pretty unusual, I suspect, from the point of view of, students wanting to be in touch with their advisors, let alone their advisors wanting to be in touch with their students. And yet, anybody who went to Cornell or, had dealt with Walt, if you said, oh, my advisor was Walt, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, that's.
Well, I think that's the perfect way to close the interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.